Millions of dollars going to Minnesota through Governor Walz perhaps was being used to fund massive fraud.
Many people are among the Somali community in Minnesota.
6:37 a.m. The Trump administration launched a massive raid, sending 3,000 federal agents after a $3 billion Minnesota fraud operation. A well-known community artist exploited the government child care system for profit. 89 children disappeared without explanation, linked to an international organ trafficking network spanning 4 countries. More than 2.5 tons of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl were smuggled into the United States. Do you want to know how it was covered up? Press like. The truth starts now. 6:37 a.m. The situation in Minneapolis has not calmed down. The fire has not gone out. It has grown more violent with each passing week. For days, the city sank into constant tension. Sirens echoed through the night. Helicopters circled overhead. Federal vehicles lined streets once meant for ordinary traffic. What began as public outrage over the death of Renee Good during an ICE operation quickly became the spark that ignited citywide unrest. Protests flooded major intersections across Minnesota, spreading faster than authorities could contain. The Pentagon is reportedly preparing to deploy 1,500 soldiers to Minnesota as protesters continue to cause chaos for immigration agents in the state. Within just a few days, emergency calls surged by 47%. By the end of the second week, more than 3,000 federal agents had been deployed into the metro area. This was not merely crowd control. Behind the noise of the protests, investigators were confronting something far more serious, a $3 billion fraud scandal quietly unraveling. Government records later revealed that Minneapolis was hemorrhaging money at a rate of $8.2 million per day through welfare, housing, and child care programs labeled as emergency exemptions. These exemptions, originally approved to stabilize the city, were extended again and again. Oversight slowed. Audits were delayed. Inspections were quietly canceled for safety reasons. Then the words came like gasoline poured onto an open flame. During a Democratic hearing, Ilhan Omar publicly denounced ICE and the Trump administration. One single sentence endlessly replayed online became a rallying cry. The one place where we thought we would never experience this is the U.S. goddamn states. Social media exploded. The city spiraled deeper into chaos. Another voice quickly followed. Somali community artist Faisal Ahmed Jama, 46, demanded a halt to federal operations, calling them divisive and illegal. What he didn't say mattered more than what he did. His statements drew the attention of federal intelligence and exposed a truth he had concealed for nearly a decade. Investigators uncovered that Jamba operated 3 child care centers, reportedly serving 375 children every day. The numbers were perfect. With such high enrollment, government subsidies flowed steadily. When state and federal authorities raided the daycare center, linked to Jamba and his wife in North Minneapolis, they suspected systematic billing fraud. Over more than 4 years, payments to this network had exceeded $2.2 billion. As agents approached the entrance, the building was terrifyingly silent. No parents, no children, no staff. The lead inspector forced the door open. Inside, the air was cold and suffocating. There wasn't a single child inside. Everything in the rooms was untouched. One agent asked quietly, "Where did the children go?" Every suspicion ignited at once. In just 11 months, one center alone had collected $37 million in taxpayer money. Investigators discovered more than 300 fake children inside Jamba's private office. Fabricated identities built from real Social Security numbers purchased on the black market spread across his desk. A population of ghost children existed only inside the state payment system, enabling the theft of $230 million from funds meant for low-income children. The final evidence was found inside a steel safe, $27 million in cash, wrapped in black plastic, buried beneath 190 kilos of fentanyl, stamped with the eagle mark of the Sinaloa cartel. At that moment, the truth was undeniable. This was not welfare fraud. This was a private bank operating in plain sight under the cover of a daycare license. He was running a cartel bank financed by American taxpayers. If you believe stealing money meant for poor children is an unforgivable crime, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment punishment below. What investigators uncovered next forced even veteran agents to stop and think. This case was no longer simply about stolen money. It involved human lives. By mid-morning, federal auditors conducted a thorough review of the facility's licensing records. What they found violated every principle of logic. The documents showed that Jamba, along with Minneapolis unrest escalates, his wife, listed as a city official, maintained tight and continuous control over 3 locations simultaneously, all under hidden camera surveillance. Every record had been professionally and meticulously falsified. Behind it all was a file that left investigators astonished. Buried deep within encrypted files was a separate category of data, isolated, protected, and deliberately concealed from routine audits. Unlike the hundreds of ghost records used to siphon off funds, this list was short and precise. 89 names, no more, no less, marked for transport within approximately 72 hours. Each file contained medical information, blood type, tissue compatibility, age, and transport viability. These were not estimates, they were assessments. Federal analysts concluded that these 89 children had been deliberately designated as eligible, a term stripped of humanity and reduced to logistics. 89 children, 89 hearts. The documents detailed plans to transfer organs to 4 destination countries: China, India, Brazil, and Mexico. Financial projections estimated that the organs from each child could generate between 4.2 and 5.1 million on the international black market. At a minimum, the projected value of this list exceeded $1 billion. This was not random violence. It was a deliberate choice. Wire transfers linked to medical intermediaries totaled $41 million over 9 months, disguised as consulting fees and equipment purchases. None of these entities operated hospitals. Some did not even have a physical address. What stunned investigators most was the patience. The children were not taken all at once. Everything was arranged in a careful sequence. Records showed the process stretched from 18 to 36 months, allowing the network to operate slowly, quietly, and without attracting attention. The system relied on the same silence that had protected years of fraud, perfect paperwork, delayed inspections, and the assumption that no one would look too closely. All of these lives were sacrificed solely to sustain his drug trafficking network. In just over 2 years, he transported 2.5 tons of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into the United States. For older Americans reviewing the evidence, the truth was brutal. These programs were built to protect children. Instead, they were used to catalog them. 89 lives were entered into a statistical ledger. Childhood is not a renewable resource. Lost time cannot be recovered. By that point, the investigation was no longer merely an exposure. It became a moral reckoning, one that no amount of recovered money could ever erase. If you believe U.S. federal agencies can dismantle this massive criminal network, comment "Stop" to give strength to justice. At 10:58 p.m., federal prosecutors authorized a coordinated operation. This was no longer an inspection, it was a sweep. Within minutes, more than 291 FBI, ICE, and DEA tactical personnel were mobilized across Minneapolis. All 5 childcare facilities controlled by the network were breached simultaneously. An additional 12 virtual shell offices were entered, as well as tactical teams cleared the buildings. Alarms detonated across the financial system. Money began moving chaotically. In less than 18 minutes, more than $96 million was pushed through financial tunnels engineered to collapse once triggered. Someone on the other end knew the federal government was already inside. Then the confirmation came, and the operation became a hunt. Surveillance footage showed Nimco Ali Hassan leaving her residence hours earlier. Automated license plate readers tracked her vehicle heading south. Maritime records confirmed a private vessel scheduled to depart before dawn. She was fleeing, but the investigation uncovered something far worse. At 2:18 a.m., Analysts decoding encrypted communications identified a command hub 30 mi outside the city. The site was registered as an abandoned industrial zone. Tax records showed no activity for years. Utility data exposed the truth. Nightly electricity usage spiked sharply. Water consumption exceeded 90,000 gallons per day. At 3:06 a.m., aerial surveillance drones confirmed activity. Vehicles entered the compound on fixed schedules. Exhaust smoke poured from multiple ventilation shafts. This was not a warehouse. This was a factory funded with money stolen from Minnesota's children. At 4:21 a.m., the final order was issued. Entry was authorized. Headlights cut through the darkness as tactical teams advanced toward the primary access points. The structure no longer appeared industrial. It appeared fortified. The first breach was silent. A controlled charge shattered a reinforced steel door. Seconds later, gunfire erupted. Cartel members inside the facility opened fire on federal agents as entry teams pushed through the breach. Muzzle flashes lit the corridors as agents returned fire and took cover. The exchange was brief but violent. Tactical units advanced methodically, clearing rooms under live fire. Within 10 minutes, the resistance collapsed. 19 cartel members were subdued on site. 89 children identified, 3 sustained minor injuries. The remaining suspects were restrained, forced to their knees, and secured at gunpoint. The scene was contained. Inside, the air was not just hot, it was toxic. Agents reported a metallic taste the moment the seals were broken. Industrial filtration systems lined the walls, operating at full capacity to mask chemical emissions from thermal satellites. Conveyor belts continued to run. Production counters continued to climb. Beyond a secondary corridor, agents discovered the human cost. Inside a dark detention room, they found 62 people. 17 were U.S. citizens. The rest came from multiple countries. Several had been reported missing 6 to 9 months earlier. They sat on the floor, starving and terrified. One man's heart rate barely registered above 40 beats per minute. And the workers were not merely prisoners. They were ghosts. Their fingerprints had been erased with acid to prevent identification if they escaped. This was the cartel's insurance policy against human error as rescue teams evacuated the detainees. Evidence units advanced into the production sector. What they uncovered stunned even seasoned agents. Stolen childcare subsidies had been used to purchase precursor chemicals. Financial ledgers showed $1.44 billion in purchases over 18 months. The factory produced 32 to 38 tons of fentanyl per day and more than 71 tons of cocaine per week. It was a closed loop. The government funded childcare. Childcare laundered the money. The money fueled the drug factory. The drugs devastated communities. By 5:19 a.m., the scale of the operation was undeniable. The production facility spanned 4 floors. One log recorded a single week's output valued at over $3.2 billion. As dawn broke, the entire complex was fully secured. The silence that followed was unbearable. If you believe the United States needs a comprehensive audit of every welfare program, comment accountability below. At 10:26 a.m., federal briefings began inside a heavily secured facility. Confirmed financial losses to taxpayers now exceeded $7.3 billion, money that never reached the people it was meant to protect. Investigators concluded that more than 70,000 low-income children statewide lost access to child care services after funds were diverted into this criminal network. Legitimate child care providers were forced to shut down, unable to compete with a scheme that paid no food costs, no staff wages, and no maintenance expenses. In several neighborhoods, licensed child care capacity fell by nearly 22%, leaving working families without options. The system was not blind. It chose not to see. Approvals became automatic. Oversight became procedural. In a framework designed for efficiency, repetition was mistaken for reliability, and volume was mistaken for legitimacy. This case compelled a hard examination of the vulnerabilities inside the American welfare system. For years, the priority had been access, moving money quickly to those in need. But speed killed verification. Safeguards were relaxed, exceptions normalized, and warning signals buried beneath administrative momentum. The network of ghost children exploited the very compassion that defined the system. They understood that officials feared asking difficult questions. They weaponized political correctness, regulatory fatigue, and institutional caution to steal billions of dollars in plain sight. The investigation into Nimco Ali Hassan demonstrated that the most dangerous threats do not always resemble criminals. Sometimes they look like community pillars, they attend meetings, they follow procedures, they complete paperwork flawlessly, and they steal the future right in front of us. This was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of accountability. Red flags appeared repeatedly. Duplicate addresses, recycled identities, implausible enrollment growth. But each signal was dismissed in favor of continuity. The factory was shut down. The accounts were frozen. Assets were seized. Yet the deeper question remains unanswered. How many other empty facilities are operating right now, collecting millions while children receive nothing? How many programs are reporting perfect compliance while delivering zero impact? How many systems reward silence over scrutiny? This case exposed a truth that can no longer be ignored. When oversight becomes ceremonial, fraud becomes inevitable. Compassion without verification becomes an invitation. And when institutions prioritize speed over integrity, exploitation follows. The damage is not measured only in dollars, but in lost childhoods, closed businesses, and broken trust. The lesson is stark and unavoidable. Accountability is not optional. It is the only defense against systemic abuse. The machines can be rebuilt, the funds can be recovered, but unless the culture changes, unless questions are welcomed and verification is restored, the same vulnerabilities will be exploited again by actors just as disciplined, just as patient, and just as invisible. When the doors were finally sealed and the lights went out at the exposed facilities, Minneapolis did not feel relief. It felt hollow. Federal armed raids within 72 hours, the consequences rippled outward with brutal speed. More than 18,000 families across the Twin Cities received abrupt notices that their child care placements were suspended or terminated. Parents who had structured their entire work lives around licensed care suddenly had nothing. By the end of the week, local employment offices reported a 14% spike in emergency leave requests, overwhelmingly from single parents and grandparents raising children. This was not an inconvenience. It was an economic shock. The damage spread fast. Investigators confirmed that at least 146 legitimate child care providers had already closed over the previous 3 years, unable to compete with centers that paid zero food costs, zero staff wages, and zero maintenance expenses. Those closures were no accident. They were the silent casualties of a system distorted by fraud. In several working-class neighborhoods, licensed childcare capacity collapsed by nearly 22%, creating what officials quietly called care deserts. The numbers were staggering, but the human cost was worse. State analysts concluded that more than 70,000 low-income children lost access to early child care services as funds were siphoned away. These were not abstract statistics. These were toddlers missing meals, children losing structured learning, and families pushed into survival mode. One internal report estimated that households affected by the collapse lost an average of $400 per month in wages due to missed work. For families already living on the margin, that was catastrophic. In immigrant communities, fear replaced trust almost overnight. Community centers reported attendance drops of 30 to 40% as parents pulled back, worried that any interaction with social services could place them under scrutiny. The irony was painful. Thousands of innocent families already struggling paid the price for a scheme they had no part in. The silence that followed was not ignorance. It was self-P protection. City infrastructure strained under the weight. Emergency assistance requests surged by 19% in a single month. Food banks reported record demand. Shelters quietly prepared for an influx they could not handle. Minneapolis had not lost money alone. It had lost stability. And still, the most unsettling realization came from what investigators did not find. There were no warning sirens, no dramatic system failures. The fraud had not crashed the welfare network. It had coexisted with it, undetected for years. The paperwork was perfect. The forms were flawless. The approvals never stopped. The system did exactly what it was designed to do: move money quickly, efficiently, and without asking too many questions. By the time the truth emerged, the city was already hollowed out. This was not just a criminal operation stealing billions. It was a slow extraction of opportunity conducted in plain sight. Legitimate businesses collapsed. Families lost livelihoods. Children lost time that can never be replaced. Trust, once broken, did not return with a press conference. As Minneapolis tried to regain its footing, one fact became unavoidable. The cost of this operation could not be measured only in dollars. It was measured in closed classrooms, empty neighborhoods, and exhausted families staring at calendars they could no longer control. The raid ended the scheme, but it left behind a city forced to reckon with the damage it never saw coming. By the time the dust settled in Minneapolis, one truth had become impossible to ignore. This operation did not survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was allowed. As investigators moved beyond the crime scenes and into administrative records, the focus shifted away from Nimco Ali Hassan herself. The real question was no longer what she did. It was who made it possible. Over a 5-year period, Hassan's network received more than 1,200 separate approvals from state and municipal offices. Licensing renewals were granted automatically. Payment authorizations were signed in batches. In some cases, a single official approved over $94 million in reimbursements in under 48 hours without conducting a single on-site verification. This was not negligence in isolation. It was repetition. It was routine. Internal audit logs revealed that at least 17 red flags were formally recorded and dismissed. Duplicate child records, identical enrollment lists across different locations, facilities reporting perfect attendance 365 days a year, including holidays and blizzards. One center claimed to serve 163 infants with a staff of 2. No follow-up occurred. Why? Because the system rewarded speed, not scrutiny. Between 2020 and 2024, Minnesota expanded emergency childcare funding by nearly 62%, driven by political pressure to get money out the door. Verification requirements were quietly reduced. Physical inspections dropped by 41% statewide. In several districts, inspectors were instructed to rely on documentation compliance rather than system collapse and accountability in-person checks. Paper replaced presence, forms replaced reality, and the forms were flawless. Investigators later confirmed that the same approval officer signatures appeared on over 70% of Hassan-linked reimbursements. These were not low-level clerks. They were senior administrators shielded by layers of procedure. No bribes were documented, no cash exchanges found. What existed instead was something far more dangerous: institutional comfort. No one wanted to be the person who slowed the process. No one wanted to ask questions that might be interpreted as bias. No one wanted to challenge a community leader whose paperwork was always perfect. Silence became policy. Meeting transcripts painted a disturbing picture. Concerns were raised briefly, then redirected. Phrases like "no actionable discrepancy" and "within acceptable variance" appeared again and again. In one meeting, an analyst questioned how a single operator could manage 5 high-capacity centers simultaneously. The response was recorded in writing. Volume indicates success. Volume did not indicate success. Volume masked theft. By the end of 2023, Hassan's network had cycled funds through 43 intermediary accounts, all of which passed compliance checks. Not one triggered a mandatory escalation. Not one was frozen until federal agents intervened. The system did not fail loudly. It failed quietly, and it failed consistently. This was not about one corrupt official. It was about a culture that mistook repetition for legitimacy and politeness for integrity. The machinery functioned smoothly while billions vanished. And that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. This network did not break the system. It used it exactly as designed. By choosing convenience over confrontation and speed over verification, the doors were not forced open. They were held open day after day, signature after signature, until the cost became impossible to ignore. When federal agents closed the last file and the final account was frozen, the investigation reached its legal conclusion, but the moral reckoning had only begun. The collapse of Nimco Ali Hassan's network forced an uncomfortable realization at the highest levels of government. This was not an isolated anomaly. It was a repeatable model, one that required no hacking, no violence, and no deception of the system itself, only patience, paperwork, and silence. Federal analysts reviewing the case issued a warning that never reached the press. Using conservative modeling, they concluded that similar welfare-linked fraud structures could be operating in as many as 14 states, hidden inside programs designed to move money quickly during emergencies. If even 1% of national child care and social service funding were compromised at the same scale, the losses would exceed $32 billion annually. That number alone should stop anyone cold. But the danger was never just financial. Investigators discovered that Hassan's operation exploited a structural weakness shared by nearly every modern welfare system: compassion without verification. Programs built to help vulnerable populations were intentionally designed to minimize friction. Oversight was reduced to avoid delays. Questions were discouraged to avoid offense. Speed became the highest virtue, and speed killed accountability. Across the country, auditors identified thousands of facilities reporting perfect compliance. No absences, no complaints, no irregular expenses. In theory, perfection looked admirable. In practice, it was statistically impossible. One internal review found that fewer than 0.3% of legitimate child care centers maintain full enrollment year-round. Yet in emergency-funded programs, that number mysteriously jumped to over 11%. No alarm sounded. The system rewarded those who blended in. The most chilling discovery was how easily trust became a weapon. Hassan's network did not intimidate regulators. It did not bribe them. It relied on something far more reliable: the fear of asking difficult questions. Officials hesitated. Inspectors deferred. Administrators approved. Everyone assumed someone else was checking. No one was. By the time the truth surfaced, the damage extended far beyond Minnesota. Financial forensics linked stolen subsidies to drug production, human trafficking, and offshore laundering. Every dollar diverted into that closed loop multiplied harm downstream. Overdoses, crime, missing persons, and destabilized communities. The system had not simply been robbed, it had been turned against itself. For older Americans watching this unfold, the implications were especially stark. These programs were built over generations, funded by decades of payroll taxes and public trust. They were meant to protect children, families, and the most vulnerable among us. Instead, they became pipelines for exploitation. The final audit that over 110,000 children nationwide may have been indirectly affected by similar schemes. Children who never received services that were fully paid for in their names. Childhood is not refundable. Lost time cannot be reimbursed. The factories were shut down, the accounts were seized, the headlines moved on, but the question refused to disappear. How many empty buildings are still operating today? Doors locked, lights off, while millions flow in on paper? How many programs report flawless compliance while delivering nothing at all? How many officials sleep well, comforted by forms that look correct while reality is never checked? This case proved one brutal truth. When oversight becomes ceremonial, fraud becomes inevitable. When systems prioritize speed over integrity, exploitation is not an accident, it is an outcome. And when institutions punish scrutiny more than theft, silence becomes the most valuable currency of all. The machines can be rebuilt. The funds can be recovered. But unless the culture changes, unless questions are welcomed and verification becomes non-negotiable, the same blueprint will be reused by actors just as disciplined, just as patient, and just as invisible. Accountability is not optional. It is the only defense all law enforcement